Hi everyone, Jason here from Spiritualbabies.net. You've joined us again for the Haftarah Half Hour. We are this week looking at the Haftarah for Terumah, and we are joined, as we are every week, by the ever-gracious Rabbi Joshua Neely. Welcome back, Joshua Neely.
Good to be back. Ever-gracious is a bit much, but...
Well, you are with us, and so I'm very grateful for that. So this week we are looking in 1 Kings 5:26 through 6:13, and as usual the text will be popping up on your screen, but it'd be awesome if you could open up your snacks and read along. So before we jump into this, can you give us some context to what's happening in the Torah portion that it's kind of the twin to this?
So the Torah portion of Terumah is all about the first stage of outlining what's going to be built in the wilderness. So we're at the base of Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments have been given, and God is explaining that we are also going to build this ark, and that we are going to build a menorah, and that we are going to build an altar, and we are going to build a mishkan, a tabernacle tent that will encompass them, and there will be a perimeter fence around. So all the details of this construction are being outlined and predicted. No actual building takes place in this Torah portion. It's all about what will be built later on, getting everything in order. A great reminder, as the sages say, of you plan first before you build, or as my grandfather would say, measure twice, cut once.
We have kind of a similar theme in this Haftarah portion where there seems to be some construction about to happen. It talks about relationship between Hiram and Solomon. Do we know much about Hiram?
Well, we know that that he was the king of Tyre, and Tyre is the kingdom up in Lebanon, or what is now modern-day Lebanon, although it was also called Lebanon at the time. And Hiram was a king that made an alliance with Solomon. And between the two of them, they were able to coordinate the construction of the Mishkan. And it was very important. You know, the cedars of Lebanon figure very prominently throughout the Tanakh, throughout the Bible, as a metaphor for strength and beauty. And so it was a big achievement. It was a very high stature to have them as being the underpinning wood of the temple.
So I'm curious, what's Hiram getting out of this? Was he an Israelite, or was this a business arrangement?
Generally speaking, there's a little bit of a confusion because there's more than one Hiram in Tanakh, but the general consensus, if you can call it that in any Jewish debate, is that he was a foreign king, but what he was getting out of this was a trade agreement with Solomon, and that there was a reciprocity. Foodstuffs and other things that Israel was rich in were being traded in exchange for this lumber.
The Lord had given Solomon wisdom, as he had promised him. There was friendship between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. King Solomon imposed forced labor on all Israel. The levy came to 30,000 men. He sent them to the Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. They would spend 1 month in the Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon also had 70,000 porters and 80,000 quarriers in the hills, apart from Solomon's 3,300 officials who were in charge of the work and supervised the gangs doing the work. So Solomon's amassed this massive campaign of men. I'm kind of curious at the phrase imposed forced labor. So he just put out an edict saying everyone has to do this?
Well, it's a form of tax. This was common in most of the ancient world. A lot of people did not have what you might call ready cash. Most farmers didn't keep a lot of spare coins around, and so if they needed to pay taxes, it was done in two ways. You either paid a percentage of what you had grown, or you paid in labor. So the idea was that in the off months, when you weren't busy with your farm, you would donate under forcible direct your work for public projects. whether it be building roads, whether it be building fortresses. We also hear about Solomon building many stables for his chariots, and in this particular case, for working in the process of building the temple.
It doesn't sound too bad, a month there and 2 months at home. I imagine they were quite well looked after.
It's not too bad at this point, and certainly the people seem to be supportive of this project. But we should probably remind ourselves that at the end of Solomon's reign, and before his son Rehoboam takes over, this forced labor is not well looked upon, and is one of the major grievances that the people, the elders, levy against his son. And when his son refuses to relent and then says, no, I'm going to do it even worse, my father whipped you with leather, I'll whip you with scorpions, that's when the kingdom splits. So unfortunately, we begin to see the cracks here. It's also a very interesting counterpoint to what we see in the Torah portion. In the Torah portion, the collection and construction of the Mishkan is done entirely voluntarily. And it makes great efforts to point out that everything was done voluntarily. People gave what they wanted, people gave what they could, they donated their skills as they were gifted to have such skills. We don't get quite the same feeling here. The feeling here is definitely more of, this is a royal operation, and the king will determine what you can do, not your own spirit and heart. And there's some implicit criticism of that, I believe, in this project. It's interesting to note out as well on a different topic, the concept of chokhmah, of wisdom. The Haftarah could have begun just in verse 27 just fine, but it went out of its way to begin with this idea of Solomon being granted wisdom, as we know from earlier episodes in his life. And the question is, what is that wisdom that he got? Most of us think wisdom is wisdom, but wisdom has some technical definitions, and it also has some functional definitions, and the technical usually dominated in this age. So wisdom literature among the other ancient Near Eastern cultures and the Egyptians was a very highly prized commodity. The more books you had memorized, and there weren't that many, but the more books you had memorized, the more proverbs you had committed to memory or could recite, or if you were very great, could write your own. That was how you were esteemed. It was a very mechanical process. If you remembered the wisdom that had been given to you, you were considered wise. And what we see here is a functional definition of wisdom, that Solomon was wise because he was able to make friendship, that he was able to make peace and a connection with King Hiram. And that's a new concept, that the wisdom being reflected in this human connection rather than the mere acquisition of traditional literature. I think it goes a little bit beyond just basic diplomacy. I think there's a bit more of a statement that what's being done here is good. You have to remember, again, up until this point, Israel had been having mostly problems with her neighbors. A lot of fighting, a lot of attacks against Israel, and much of its time was spent defending itself. And here we see, rather than defending ourselves against a foreign invader, we are cooperating with someone for mutual benefit. And that's a very nice thing. To be able to seek peace and to find a partner for peace is a wonderful turning in our nation's history.
The king ordered huge blocks of choice stone to be quarried, so that the foundations of the house might be laid with hewn stone. Solomon's masons, Hiram's masons, and the men of Gebal shaped them. Thus the timber and the stones for the building of the house were made ready. In the 480th year, after the Israelites left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, that is the second month in the 4th year of his reign over Israel, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. The house which King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. The portico in front of the great hall of the house was 20 cubits long, along the width of the house, and 10 cubits deep to the front of the house. He made windows for the house, recessed and latticed.
The JPS translation, although remarkably smooth, is sometimes a little too smooth. So if we just back up to verse 4.
Yeah, sure.
where it said, what was the version that it was in the JPSE? He built the windows
And made windows for the house.
and latticed.
Hmm.
So it's not actually 100% clear that it means recessed and latticed. The general interpretation that's been followed by the rabbinic sources is that the Hebrew was actually talking about windows that were broad on the inside and they were narrow on the outside, which is a little weird. Usually you would have a wider opening to let more light in, and that would be sort of standard. But this seems to be the opposite, that you were narrow on the interior wall of the temple and wide on the outside. And well, if you think like a flashlight, normally what you want to do is you want to have the flashlight has the narrow part where the bulb is, and then the widest part that's projecting towards. You would expect the wide part to be focusing inwards where you wanted the light. But as the sages point out in Leviticus Rabbah, it was because the temple wasn't there to get light from the world. The temple was there to give light to the world. And so its windows were there to spread light out rather than to gather light in. And that whole teaching is totally missed with the JPS translation of being recessed and latticed. It's a lovely translation and maybe is a perfectly accurate depiction, but it doesn't capture the awkwardness of the Hebrew, which is, according to our sages, meant to trigger a reaction and an interpretation rather than just a architectural description.
Against the outside wall of the house and outside walls of the house, enclosing the Great Hall and the shrine. Is the shrine the Holy of Holies, or is that a different area? Yes,
exactly right. The shrine, the term that's being used for shrine here is the Holy of Holies, yes.
Okay, and enclosed the Great Hall and the shrine. He built a storied structure, and he made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide, the middle one was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. So it got bigger as it went up?
Not exactly. Usually the interpretation has to do with the interior space of the roundabout. And so the interior space got bigger because it had less weight of upper story pushing down on it. And so you had a thicker wall at the base, and then as you went up, it was only holding up 2 stories, and so then on the top one, it was only holding up the roof. So the outer wall would have looked the same all the way around, but the chambers would have been getting larger as they went up inside that wall.
I see where you're coming from. A lot of the early medieval castles used to put the foundations on the outside rather than the inside, but this is doing the opposite. Okay. For he had provided recesses around the outside of the house so as not to penetrate the walls of the house.
Well, the whole idea is that the beams and the ways of supporting the walls were not supposed to penetrate into the temple itself. You didn't want construction work, scaffolding, framework, and all the other things that went into these ancient buildings that were massive, but still architecturally challenging at the time. To be intruding into the temple itself, the temple proper. And so these outer structures and support systems were built to keep the temple up without having to penetrate into it.
So it's very minimalist. It was nice and clean on the outside, flat walls, and on the inside very clean.
Yeah, flat and paneled on the inside, exactly. I made a model once for a friend of the first temple, and when you build it, in 3 dimensions, you can see this was a very striking and simple lined construction. And compared to the gaudy edifices of Egypt, which are very attractive if you're a tourist, but were a little overmuch, if you ask me. This is without carvings, without decorations, except for the very top of 2 of the pillars. It must have been a very beautiful, gleaming structure there on the hill of Jerusalem.
When the house was built, only finished stones cut from the quarry were used, so that no hammer or axe or any iron tool was heard in the house while it was being built.
Now with laser levels and proper tape measures and good moving materials, that's easy. But back then, if you said, okay, I've got a hole that I need a new block for that's this big, you had to then go all the way to the quarry and tell someone exactly how big of the block you needed. They had to cut it perfect there. Then you had to carry it all the way back, and if it was wrong, you had to take it all the way back to the quarry. So this does introduce a whole new complication in the construction. But it would have meant that the building site itself would have been remarkably quiet compared to other construction projects.
Yeah, it must have been a bit of a nightmare, because even if you're building a brick wall, there's still a certain amount of tapping and knocking and nudging and you know, shearing bits off that it's not quite right. But to have to travel to do that every time, or to pass a message to someone.
Mm-hmm. And when you don't exactly have what we would consider modern tools for measuring and transferring the measurement to a new block, it would have been a much greater undertaking than just building it on site from whatever rocks were available and just carving them as you needed.
The entrance of the middle of the side chamber was on the right side of the house, and winding stairs led up to the middle chambers, and from the middle chambers to the third story. When he finished building the house, he panelled the house with beams and planks of cedar. He built the storied structures against the entire house, each story 5 cubits high, so that it encased the house with timbers of cedar. So all of the walls are now cedar panelled walls.
The general interpretation is that was the interior walls were wooden panelled. It's a little unclear from the text directly, but that's the general interpretation. You can see it's an imported good. It's something that the kingdom is paying dearly for. This was a huge cost and embellishment, and something that the average person would never dream to be able to do. You might as well tell a modern person that you're covering your walls in gold. It's just wow. They were willing to do that. It just wow. And of course, it also is on another note, perhaps Solomon trying to fulfill his father's wish. Remember, David said, "Here I am sitting in a palace of cedar, and the ark is in a tent." Well, maybe this was trying to make good that God should have cedar too. God didn't ask for cedar, and either last year or the year before in my Torah study, which I believe is online, we talked about the difference between the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and whether or not it was built the best way, or whether it was good to have been built, and all of that. So there are a lot of questions about this whole construction process.
I like the idea that then the word of the Lord came to Solomon with regard to this house you are building. If you follow my laws and observe my rules and faithfully keep my commandments, I will fulfill for you the promise which I gave to your father David. I will abide among the children of Israel. I will never forsake my people Israel. That's a great couple of lines to end on.
It is incredibly powerful and incredibly necessary. From the human point of view, what Solomon did was an amazing glorification of God. And it seemed to create a sense of permanence of God's presence within the nation. And that was wonderful. But God here is not just praising what Solomon has done, he's also giving a warning, which is this building by itself is not what will keep me present within your people. This building can be a great symbol, a great mechanism for helping to draw the people towards me and to follow my ways, but it is keeping my commandments, following my ways, walking in my path. That is what will secure your kingship. That is what will secure the people. And all the most magnificent structures in the world don't mean anything if you're lacking that, which unfortunately is what we see actually happens throughout the rest of the period of the kings. People focus on the building more than what the building was meant to represent.
When you read the line there from 12, knowing, with that kind of intonation in mind, you can really get that. And with regards to this house you're building, if you follow my laws...
Exactly. God doesn't say, and as far as this house goes, if you keep it in good repair and you make sure that the sacrifices are always burning and that the light is wonderful and the menorah and the wood is freshly polished, that's not what God says. It's like the bite is good, and you're not done. The idea of hidur mitzvah, of the performance of a commandment in a more beautiful way than was even asked for, is a very positive feeling within Judaism. You can do Kiddush for Friday night with, the cheapest wine you've got in a paper cup, and you have still done the mitzvah. But if you, within reason, can embellish that with a nicer wine and a nicer cup, then it does elevate the act to ourselves in a way that allows us to appreciate it even more. And certainly the Beit HaMikdash was intended to do that, and God approved it on that condition. That perhaps, yes, the people did need something more magnificent to represent the new status of the kingdom, perhaps. But as magnificent as it was not replacing the main purpose of our covenant, which is keeping Torah. It was simply meant to redouble our efforts and rekindle our passion. Unfortunately, in that respect, the temple, during its heyday, had a very mixed record. Sometimes it worked well, and sometimes it didn't. I mean, we read, I believe it was just from last week's Haftarah, not the special Haftarah, but the standard one, for Mishpatim, about the fact that the people during Jeremiah's day, they walked through the temple courtyard and made this pledge to release their slaves, and then they turned around and just retook their slaves. Unfortunately, the temple, as beautiful as it was, just became the backdrop for iniquity rather than actually inspiring people towards righteousness.
That's the way, isn't it? That people become accustomed to their surroundings and they don't see what's in front of them sometimes.
Very often, but it doesn't have to be that way. That's the great tension, because there's a lot of people who try to swing the pendulum the opposite direction and remove all distractions and simplify everything and wear the simplest of clothing and pray in the simplest of forms and the simplest of settings and think that somehow that's going to create it. But the real danger is routine. The real danger is lacking mindfulness. And doing something in a better and more beautiful and splendid way should help with mindfulness, more than doing it in the most bare and stark way. But it's not, in and of itself, the solution. It's just one additional help towards doing it that way.
I think that is a perfect place to end. So there we are, everyone. That was this week's Haftarah Half Hour. Stick around to the end of the video. You'll find out what's on for next week, and you'll see under this video some links to some other programs that you can find from Rabbi Neely and from myself. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you all again next week. Bye-bye.